little PowerPoint for us. Okay, that's really weird. I've never had this display screen before. Display settings. Oh, it must be because I'm hooked up to the thing. Okay, well, we're just gonna go with it. Y'all can, oh, it looks fine for you. Okay. Yeah, I'm on presenter view. Yeah, exactly right. So I'm Heather Morigeau. This is the class that we're gonna do for weaving a pine needle medicine basket. So we're gonna, land acknowledgement. We are on the traditional lands of the Treaty 6, which is the Cree, Dene, and we're Treaty 8. Okay, can you help me? I'm forgetting one though. Isn't there one more? Okay. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. So then we're going to do the PowerPoint and then we'll start on the video. So pine needle weaving is a traditional art form of many Indigenous nations using different materials, but my teachings come from the Ktunaxa Nation in the Kootenay region, which is the nation of my great-grandmother and my cousins, and I am recognized as a cousin within that community. And because of the opportunity to have these teachings passed to me, 10% of any profits I make from teaching or selling the art is returned to the Ktunaxa Language and Culture Department to ensure the preservation of these cultural teachings for generations to come. And once COVID is over, I'll spend more time with knowledge keepers there. So here are some pine needle baskets. So, hello. What you see here is some modern pieces of traditional pine weaving. This art form has been taught to settler people and is very popular in their community. The pine needle groups that I actually belong to on Facebook, the majority of them were white folk and they didn't even know that it was an Indigenous art form, right? So it's appropriated and there isn't a lot of recognition of its traditional teachings. But what you see here is modern on either side. The one on the left has dyed pine needles, as well as pine needles with the woody ends left on it, just for display, like an extra look to them. And then the one in the middle is an antique Apache pine needle weaving, and they do a lot of work with the threads. So what we're doing around the top here with the weaving is the technique that you see there for the flower pattern. And then the one on the right is a modern piece. So that's a piece of ceramic in the middle, and then a piece of driftwood on the side there that's being attached onto it. So, and that's the spiral stitch that we're going to learn today. These are some other coiled baskets. So the art form we're learning is coiled basketry, and it's practiced around the world with many different materials. So what you're seeing here is sweetgrass and palm leaves. And again, that's the Apache. And I didn't take notes of the other one, but that white one is actually entirely beaded. So it's coiled basketry that's then beaded over top of it. And oh yeah, yeah. There's some artisans that are just like, blow my mind, amazing. Sweetgrass is another material that they'll use, and as well as willows and cedar root. So there's lots of different natural materials that can be used for this. Red willow was one that was suggested for this region. And So we have the 3 different places in the world, 3 different places that do the coiled basketry. So the Tonoho Adonam Nation in Arizona, and she's got like antique basketry in that picture there. And then in the middle, the African American population that lives in the States have really adopted the sweetgrass braiding and really made it their own, and have a really positive relationship with Indigenous sweetgrass braiders. So there's that culture. And then Mexico, they've got huge pine needles that are like a foot long, right? Like down in Florida, you can get, anytime a hurricane comes through, the pine needle people will go and collect all the pine needles that fell from the trees, and their needles are like this, right? So I look forward to going there one day, but I haven't worked with them yet. Traditional basket uses, they would actually take the baskets, and pitch is from the sap of the tree, and it's a black material, so you can see it on the inside of that water jug. They would take these baskets and coat them in pitch, and they would become entirely watertight, right? And so they could be used for jugs of water or for washing grains like you see here. And even the weave can be so tight that it will be almost completely watertight. So, you know, harvesting baskets, the Ed Carrier is a master Squamish basket maker. They mostly use cedar in their woven baskets, and he's got a basket of burden attached to his head there, which is another traditional Haida teaching or type of basket. In Africa, they do a lot of this basketry as well. They use palm leaves primarily, as well as just string. So you've got some gorgeous pieces there that are a mixture of string and palm, and in a traditional style and then a very modern style. And their baskets are also iconic, right? Like they're a really strong part of their culture and teachings. And, you know, so it's interesting to me that, you know, this art form, the coiled basketry, is practiced in many nations around the world with just different materials. This is a modern basket, air quotes, right? So like I mentioned, the settler population has really just taken off with this art form and does some really wild art styles here. And what's really unique about this is those points, right? Because it's really difficult to get like a clean, perfect point with a bunch of pine needles, right? So this is considered like a really skilled, oh, you know what I just realized? I wasn't projecting this onto Zoom. So none of this actually got onto Zoom. I'll just layer it over when I do the editing. And so, yeah, so this is some of the modern pine needle artwork that's being done around the world. The pine needles that we use, these are from the Kootenays. They're ponderosa pine needles. There's also dogwood, right? And so these are like 3 to 4 inches. Some of them can get up to like 5 inches long. In some places in the world, they can get feet long. But here, there isn't that species of pine tree here. So I just wanted to give you like some alternative materials, like the red willow is one of them. You can go to the hardware store and get a big thick rope and be able to create some beautiful baskets out of heavy rope and stitch. The one that you see in the corner there, that's made entirely out of recycled plastic bags and this technique. So, I mean, it's really, it's your imagination can take it wherever you want to go. We're going to talk a little bit about the teachings of the pine tree. So you'll notice in the pine cone that's there, there's like a very distinctive spiral of the pine cone seed as it's growing. We actually see that mimicked in the entire growth of the tree, whether it's the branches on the tree growing like a spiral, or the needles on the branches is growing like a spiral. And I suspect, I have not seen this, but I suspect that when you see the patterns of the trees growing in the forest, there's probably something, but I haven't been able to prove that yet. So this is a pattern that we see in nature. They call it the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio. And this spiral is mimicked in plants, in storms, animals, art, the galaxies. You know, it's a reoccurring pattern that really has a harmony to it and a mathematical ratio that is we can calculate how it's going to work and how it's done. So we see it in our own physical bodies with our DNA, the ratio of our body. So the golden ratio exists in the joints of our own hand, of our own face, our ears, our arms. So these teachings just show us like we're creating a spiral coil of pine needles, and this reflects what already exists in nature. So this just actually happened to be part of the PowerPoint when I was using this deck. So the best way to get started, is to quit talking and begin doing one on that. Wish I had shared my screen, but we're okay. Yeah. Was there any questions? Yeah. Yeah, I do. I specifically go in the spring, so like January, February, and when the real strong winter storms are coming through. When I acquire pine needles, I try to avoid ever cutting a branch, right? So I only want to collect the green needles that fall off the tree. So when the winter storms come through, they'll knock parts of branches down onto the ground, and I'll go and I'll just pick them up and I'll lay offerings at the tree in exchange for those needles. And then I take them home, I pull them off the branch, I dry them all, and then I start processing them. So my processing them techniques involve, sometimes I take off the woody cap, sometimes I don't. And sometimes I leave it on because it's artistically interesting. And then once the pine needles are dry, I will boil them in vegetable glycerin. Okay, so the reason I do this is because pine needles themselves are very brittle, right? Like a little bend and they'll snap. But with the glycerin, they're able to be really flexible and don't dry out the same way. So that's what I use instead of the traditional technique, which is letting them sit in water for 3 days. So when I get the pine needles, that's what I do with them. And there's a couple places in Calgary that I can collect them as well, that I've found like along Memorial Ave, right? There's a few ponderosa trees that were planted there. And so if I happen across a green branch, then I'll lay down tobacco and take the branch. Yeah. Do you have any questions? Yeah. Yeah, if you really want to get into this artwork, if you go on Etsy, you can buy bundles of pine needles. Oh, even better. Yeah, just get your sister to do it. And, you know, and just, so this is the basket that we're going to be making today. You have everything you need in your kit to make this. However, it will take more time than what we're going to have here today. So I'm going to do 2 parts of the workshop, and we're going to start it, and then I'll do after lunch, then I'll do the top ring around the very top on this basket. So I've got one like sort of in process. So you'll have both of them, and then this recording will be available to you if you're like lost in the process. So in your bag, you have a bundle of pine needles. You will have 4 bundles of one color of thread, and then you will have a bundle of 4 different colors of thread. So the 4 different colors of thread are going to be the top ring. So you can just kind of set that aside. And then the 4 of the single color, that's going to be the body of the basket itself. So everybody has different colors. And since there's only 2 of y'all, if you hate your color, you can switch it up to another basket color. But yeah, I stuck with the 4 colors of the medicine wheel. You also have a little piece of straw that is going to be used as a guide. So you can see here, this holds the pine needles together and just gives you a really nice uniform width throughout. You can buy fancy metal ones on the internet. I don't see a good reason to do that. Maybe when my fingers get older, because I ruin the pieces of straw. Like you can see here, this one's got like an edge on it from me pushing on it. Maybe the fancy metal ones are easier to work with. I don't know. This is a Slurpee straw. So this one is a wider diameter than that one. You can do this by hand and just kind of gauge it by your own eye. But I find that it just is more uniform and easier to do it with a straw. You can put it down, walk away, not have to worry about things falling apart. And it gives you a little bit more control over how it's going to look. When you are making the basket, if you do it by hand, you might be tempted to, like when you start to get impatient, which happens with any art form, you might be tempted to just put more pine needles in to your hands. But that actually just makes the basket wider. It doesn't necessarily make it go up faster, right? So that's why we use the straws as our gauge. You also have, oh, and this is a piece of like pipe, like tube. So if you go to a hardware store, you can buy like hard pieces of PVC pipe as well. You have a needle that's got a dull end so that you're not hurting yourself. You have a pine cookie. So I was driving around Calgary and I saw somebody had a ponderosa pine tree in their yard and had cut a branch off of it. So then I'm like showing up the front door of this house, knock, 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 can I have your pine tree? Sure, right? Like they were so weirded out by me. I think they actually took a video of me cutting up the branch in their yard because they're like, what is going on here? So I took that branch and I cut it up into the pine cookie slabs. And then I used something called pentacryl, which is a type of oil which stabilizes it. So this shouldn't crack. If it was just a piece of wood that you cut off a branch and then have at this width, it'll crack right down the middle when it gets dry. So this should not crack on you and it should last a really long time. The string that we're using is a waxed thread. So, and it's a woven cord or a linen cord. So you are not having to worry about waxing the thread as you're doing this. The wax holds the pine needles. So if you wanted to buy your own cotton thread and dye it whatever color you want, then you can just buy a block of beeswax and just run the thread along the block of beeswax to wax it, right? But this is just easier. When you are done the basket, you're going to take a blow dryer to the outside of the basket, and that's going to melt the wax just ever so little bit and just kind of hold everything together over time. So yeah, just when you get finished, that's what you're going to do. With these pine needles, they're not dyed, they are treated. You can dye pine needles. There's something called Dylon, D-Y-L-O-N, and Dylon is a fabric dye that you can buy and use with the vegetable glycerin to get a color to the pine needles, so you don't necessarily have to go with the green. And we're gonna get started. So, is there any questions before we get running? Great. So when we're doing this, we're going to start by filling our straw with enough pine needles so that it's kind of firm. And as we go along in this art form, you're going to want to keep checking that straw to make sure that it's full, right? If it's not full, there's a potential of a weak spot in the basket. And yeah, so you just, every stitch that you do along the process, you'll just want to double check and make sure, hey, is it still working? Does it look good? You know, is this straw solid? So we're just grabbing some and we're making sure that the ends are coming out all in one direction. Some pine needles are singles, some are doubles, some are long, some are short, and they're just like individuals in a community. They're all coming together to make one beautiful basket. So I try not to be too picky about the quality of needles. Some of them break, some of them are bent. Yours should not be bent. You should have very nice straight ones in your bundle there. Okay, so you can see this straw is now firm, full of pine needles. Probably fit a couple more in there. We'll just give it a little. Yep. Yeah, we're good. Then once it's full, you're going to take your string for the basket and tie a double knot with a little bit of a tail onto the end of the pine needles. My bracelet is irritating me today. So you'll just have a double knot there at the end of the pine needles. And I've got a big mess of string in my, here some, right. Yeah, a little bit of a tail for sure, yeah. So then we're gonna come to the wood cookie. And if I get too far ahead, just let me know. Now, once we start working with the wood cookie, we're not gonna wanna let go. So we'll always have the end of the string in our hand, pulling tension. And because if we let go, once we start weaving, then it's gonna come undone and won't be as strong. So I just put the needle through one of the holes, and then I'm just going to take the tail and tie it again 2 times, pulling it really tight to the side of the pine cookie. And we're going to work along the side because it's kind of like a brace. You can start baskets from the very middle.
So from the very center.
Bottom to top. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, we're gonna go bottom to top through the whole process. So this piece is needles all the way to the middle. Okay, but this tends to get very, like you can see it's about the same size. And this took me like a couple hours to make just this mount. So we're kind of cutting corners with the pine base, but you can use anything for the base. You can use beading, you can use pieces of wood, ceramic, metal, anything you like. So it's kind of nice to have that base there. Yeah, you're going to do double knot, and so that you're pulling it really tight to the side of the cookie. The double knot, yeah. So we're running it through the one of the holes in the pine cookie, and then we're taking the tail that we used for tying the pine needles together, and we're using that to make, yeah. All right, so now we're going to start weaving, and this is the part where we don't want to let go. So the stitch that we're going to do for the base, let me make sure I'm in perfectly in the shot here. So we're going to take our thread and wrap it around the needles once, and then come through the bottom of the pine cookie. So bottom to top. And then we will pull this as tight as we possibly can to the side of the pine cookie. So, and then hold it tight against the cookie with your thumb while you're doing the next stitch. Okay, so the next stitch, same as the first stitch, loop it around once, and then go through the next hole. And pull it tight. And then just move the straw. If you catch it under the string, it's going to get stuck. Just push the straw along. So after your second stitch, pull it tight. After the second stitch, you're going to realize that the straw has lost some of its thickness. So we're going to come over to the bundle of pine needles, and we're going to thread a couple pine needles into the straw to get that tension back. So it's nice and firm again. And then we're going to push the pine needle or the straws along the pine needle. Now we're going to wrap around once, and then the second time come up through the next hole. Pull it really tight. As tight as you can pull it. And then check the firmness of the straw. I can probably fit one in there. With every stitch, you want to check that straw. So wrap it around. Push this down. Wrap it around once, and then the second wrap, come up through the bottom. So this is the pattern that you're going to want to have. So it'll be loop and then through the hole, loop through the hole, loop through the hole, loop through the hole. And you want to do that all the way around the pine cookie and constantly checking the thickness of the straw. And when I'm weaving the pine needles into the straw, I try and push them into the middle of the straw. And that just kind of hides them from coming through. I don't know if you can see. Is that going to come through? So you can, yeah. So you can see if they're on the outside, then they kind of stick through a little bit. But if they're on the inside, then they kind of get held under by the ones around it. And if you have a hole like this, where it's through the bark and not through the wood itself, instead of going through that hole, you'll just do an extra loop. So I'll show you when I get there. Because I think if I pull on this one that's in the bark, it'll break through the bark. Oh yeah, when the straw falls off, it is so hard to get it all back in. I'm just putting some more pine needles in, and you just want to push them as far in as they will go. I'm gonna try this one that's drilled through the bark, but it might break. And if you find that your stitches are loose along the way, you'll just want to get in there with the needle and pull towards your thumb, right? So you'll just go along until you get all the way to the thumb. So it didn't break. It's almost broken. You can see it kind of stretched through there. Cut through the bark, but we're going to keep going. It's going to hold it. Even if it wasn't, even if it didn't hold it, just to do a loop, right? So it's basically like loop and then stitch through the hole. So if you don't have a hole to go through, then just add another loop. And just keep checking the straw and making sure that you keep it full of pine needles. It got a little thin in this spot here, so you can see the thickness of the string. It's kind of narrow. tight, wrap around, and then come up through the bottom. Tangle there. When I do this, I sometimes watch TV, but I always try and watch good shows or try and be in a good mood when I'm weaving, because whatever I'm feeling kind of goes into the basket. And I regularly give these baskets, like I've never sold one of these baskets. I always give them away to elders and knowledge keepers that I work with. Sometimes I have them full of medicine, sometimes just the basket itself, right? And so I want to make sure that when I'm weaving, I'm putting my best energy into that basket. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I am a terrible beater. I'm so bad. I've tried a couple times and it doesn't gel for me. But when I did pine needle weaving for the first time, it just clicked. It just felt right. Just constantly checking that straw to make sure it's got lots of pine needles in it. And just a wrap around up through the hole. This is such a beautiful place. I see why you live here. Driving out, it was just so gorgeous, like the sun and the blue sky and all the muskeg. Oh, it was gorgeous. Yeah, the lake is amazing. Do you fish? Yeah. No, just to protect. Yeah. Just to protect the population of the fish. It's catch and release. Right. Oh yeah. Yeah, in Calgary, the water has whirling disease. The fish have whirling disease. So they say you can eat them. I don't know if I would. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is my last hole before I get back to the first one that I used. So when I'm at this point, I'm going to want to push the tips of the pine needles down and the points of the pine needles will come up. So they're going to kind of lift over each other. And because my tail is so long, I'm going to try and catch it in my next stitch. Yeah. So I'm going to come around and go underneath underneath the tail there, the end of the pine needles. And then around, and then pull that. It's going to take some fancy work. And then I'm gonna, my straw is almost empty here, so I'm just gonna take a second to refill it. And by this point, my hand's starting to cramp up from holding it for so long. This is the hardest. This and the top are the hardest parts because you can't let go. But once you start weaving the pine needles on the next stitch, then the pine needles hold the string for you. So you can let go, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to hold it the whole time. You can walk away from it and come back. It's just this first and last process that's very, see, this one has a woody end on it. Some people like to expose those in their art. All right, so this is my last stitch on the base. I went around once. Now I'm gonna come around and go through that first hole that I went through. Oops. Come on. Pull it as tight as I can. And you can see here I've got the tail, oops, I've got the tail pushed down and caught by the string because it was long enough that I could do that. But the coil is pushed above that beginning point where we started it. Now this is going to be my first stitch into the pine needles themselves. I'm going to go up and over and around. Oop. I'm sorry, I was bleeding a little bit. I was sanding yesterday and I didn't wear gloves, so my hands are a little raw because I should have been wearing gloves when I was sanding. But anyway, we're okay. So, oops. All right, so the pine needles are going clockwise. So my stitch is going to go counterclockwise, right? So we're gonna go through the pine needles and through the string at an angle like this. So the pine needles are going this way, but we're going to go this way with the stitch. So we go up and over and around, and then we go through the pine needles and through the string. So this is what your stitch will look like, where it's going back on itself. That's okay. I just want to get this stitch done so I can let go of it. Because once I get this stitch done, then I don't have to stress about holding the tension. There. See, now I can let go and it's just going to hold itself together. So that's why I wanted to get to that point because my hands was starting to cramp up. So I'll let you all get to your first stitch and then I'll keep going.